Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wonder why you can sometimes feel anxious just by being around someone else who is stressed out? It's like catching a cold, but with feelings. Well, this new study dives deep into whether empathy and imagining bad things can make anxiety spread between people. So, the big question here is, can we catch anxiety from others? And if so, what is going on in our brains and minds when that happens? This research team wanted to find out if empathy, that ability to understand and share someone else's feelings, and mental imagery, like picturing things in our heads, play a role in making anxiety contagious. They ran 6 different experiments with over 1,000 people to really get to the bottom of this. The researchers actually created a new way to make people feel anxious just by showing them what someone else was feeling. Imagine seeing that a friend or an acquaintance is super worried about something, and then you start feeling worried too, even if you know nothing bad has actually happened to you yet. That's what they were able to do in their lab. In their first study, they told participants they were going to look at some really distressing pictures. Before they saw them, they rated how anxious they felt. Then they were shown some ratings and written thoughts from another student who had supposedly just done the same task. This other student was either described as really worried or completely calm. What they found was pretty striking. When people saw that the other person was worried, their own anxiety went up. But if they saw that the other person was calm, their anxiety didn't change much, or it even went down. This showed for the first time in their setup that anxiety seemed to be catching. It wasn't just people saying they felt more anxious. When the researchers looked at the words people used to describe their feelings, they found that people who saw the worried partner used more anxiety words after the exposure than before. This was a really neat way to see the emotional contagion happening. The next steps were to make sure this anxiety contagion was real and then to figure out why it was happening. So, they ran 2 more studies called Study 2A and 2B, which were basically bigger and better versions of Study 1. They again saw that anxiety spread from the worried partner. Now, for the why, they measured how empathetic people felt. They found that people felt more for the worried partner. Things like feeling sympathetic, distressed, and actually trying to see things from that person's point of view. This tells us that our ability to connect with another person's distress is a part of this process. Then they looked at mental imagery. They asked participants if they had imagined negative things or flash forwards of bad outcomes, even though they hadn't actually seen the scary pictures yet. And guess what? The more vivid these imagined negative pictures were, the more anxious people became, but only when they were exposed to the worried partner. This is a crucial piece of the puzzle. This is where it gets really interesting. They proposed a model first. You empathize with the worried person. Then, because you are putting yourself in their shoes, you start to imagine those negative things happening to you. You have these flash forwards or vivid images of bad stuff. And it is these imagined bad things that actually make you feel anxious. It's a chain reaction. Empathy leads to imagining bad things, which leads to anxiety. But how do we know this is really how it works? They decided to interfere with the mental imagery part to see if it actually stopped the anxiety contagion. This is where the intervention studies come in. They had people play different games or do different tasks after being exposed to the worried partner information. They had people play Tetris, do a visual memory task called the decorsy task, or a sound-based memory task. The idea was to see what happens when you occupy the brain's workspace, the part that holds visual or auditory information, and the results were fascinating. When people played Tetris or did the decorsy task, which both use visual working memory, the anxiety contagion stopped. But when they did the auditory task or a simple control task, the anxiety still spread. This is strong evidence that the visual part of our imagination is key to catching anxiety from others. This figure really highlights it. The anxiety change on the y-axis shows how much people's anxiety increased. In the Tetris and decorsy conditions, this change was very small, meaning the contagion was blocked. But in the digit span and control groups, anxiety clearly went up, showing the contagion happened. To pull everything together, they did a mini meta-analysis, which is like a study of studies, looking at people's general tendencies to be empathetic, or to imagine things. They found that people who reported being more naturally empathetic and more prone to mental imagery were indeed more likely to catch anxiety in their experiments. This confirms that these aren't just temporary feelings that happen in the lab, but they're linked to our personality. It also showed that people who generally worry a lot or are more generally anxious are also more susceptible to this anxiety contagion. This makes sense from a clinical perspective. So, what does all of this mean? The researchers built a solid case that anxiety isn't just something that happens to you individually. It can spread socially through empathy and mental imagery. When you feel for someone else's worry, your brain starts picturing those bad things. And that's what fuels your own anxiety. This is super important because it suggests we can develop ways to combat this spread. Now, the study has some limitations, which is normal for science. For instance, their setup involved picturing visual threats. The researchers point out that we need to explore if this happens with other kinds of fears, not just visual ones. Also, the effect sizes, meaning how strong the contagion was, were generally small. This means the study found a way to induce and reduce modest amounts of anxiety. Another interesting point is the slight overlap between anxiety contagion and personal distress. Personal distress is feeling upset for someone else, and anxiety contagion is feeling anxious yourself. They found these were very closely related, and future research will need to tease them apart more. But the big takeaway is powerful. We've learned that our capacity for empathy and our capacity for mental imagery are actually key ingredients for how anxiety spreads. This knowledge is a huge step towards creating interventions to stop anxiety from spreading, much like we learned how to stop physical illnesses. Imagine schools or workplaces using these ideas to help people manage collective anxiety. It's about understanding the invisible lines that connect our emotional states. And it's great to see that the researchers are committed to transparency, making their data and methods available. This allows other scientists to build on their work. And just a quick note, when they looked at words related to anger or sadness, they didn't find the same contagion effect, which really highlights that it's specifically anxiety, not just general negative feelings, that's spreading in this way. These pilot studies were important because they helped the researchers figure out the right amount of time for their intervention tasks to make sure their main experiment in study 3C would work. It's all about careful planning in science. Here they looked at how enjoyable or difficult the tasks were. It turns out Tetris was the most fun, and the D-Corsi task was seen as the most difficult, which also gives us confidence that the different tasks were really doing different things to people's minds. This shows they went the extra mile to make sure people were actually doing the tasks properly, not just clicking through. And thankfully, their main findings held up even after these stricter checks. These figures show how they tested their models. The arrows represent the connections between different psychological processes, helping them visualize the whole chain reaction. And these show the detailed pathways they found, like empathy leading to imagined fears, which then leads to actual anxiety. It is like a roadmap of how anxiety spreads. This table just shows that the questionnaires they used were reliable, meaning they consistently measured what they were supposed to. So, what is my take on all of this? This research is really exciting because it provides a clear, testable model for how anxiety spreads, by identifying empathy and mental imagery as key players, and even showing we can experimentally block this spread by engaging visual working memory. They've opened the door for practical interventions. Think about simple activities like playing a game or doing a memory task when we feel overwhelmed by shared anxiety. Of course, the effects observed were modest, and more research is needed to see how this plays out in real-world, high-stakes situations, and with people experiencing clinical levels of anxiety. But the fundamental insight that we can visualize and feel our way into someone else's anxiety, and that we can potentially interrupt that process, is a massive step forward. It really puts the power back into our hands to manage our collective emotional well-being. If you found this as fascinating as I did, give this video a thumbs up. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on anxiety contagion, and don't forget to subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more psychology deep dives. Thanks for watching.